Hello again. This is likely to be rather a long video, so I hope that those with shorter attention spans will be able to stay with it. I want to talk today about the way that racism, scientific racism that is, became unpopular. In fact, it became wholly unacceptable. It is wholly unacceptable, which is really odd because the position has changed since the 1930s. In the course of the last something under a century, the situation has changed from almost everybody subscribing to the idea of scientific racism in the Western world to absolutely nobody subscribing to it, and it becoming a taboo subject. I'd like to talk about the history of scientific racism a little and see what happened to change people's minds, as it were. Up until the start of the Second World War, the idea of scientific racism, together with the tenets of eugenics, were championed by any number of respectable politicians and scientists. This is not to say that dissenters didn't exist, but many people in Europe and the United States were assured of what appeared to be a scientific consensus, that the human race was divided into different races, and that generally speaking the white race was superior to the others. Similarly, the idea of sterilising the incurably insane, the severely learning disabled, and even the feckless and idle was acceptable, and the advocacy of such schemes was not greeted with the horror and disgust which would now attend any proposal to carry out vasectomies on unwilling patients to prevent them passing on genes for madness or laziness. The change in perception of such things may be dated precisely, although it took time to spread across the whole of the civilised world. As Allied troops swept through Europe, they came across horrors such as most people could not have imagined in their worst nightmares. In camps like Belsen, liberated on the 15th of April 1945, scenes which might have come from Dante's Inferno were revealed. Just as modern technology has made possible the mass killing of human beings and their destruction on an industrial scale, so too did it make the conditions in Belsen visible to everybody in Europe and America. Newsreel films of the state of prisoners held in the camp were soon being shown in cinemas across the world. Today, the camp which most people see as embodying the Holocaust is of course Auschwitz, but for the first few years after the end of the war it was Belsen which was most widely seen as symbolic of the dreadful crimes of the Nazis. This is perhaps because the liberation of Belsen and the conditions which were found in the camp after the British occupied that part of Germany were recorded in detail by the British Army Film and Photographic Unit. The films which were taken of the 10,000 unburied corpses found when the troops first entered the camp, along with the malnourished survivors, were made into a short documentary with a commentary by BBC broadcaster Richard Dimbleby. This was shown in cinemas across Britain and it seared itself into the national consciousness. Cinema going was at that time all but universal, which meant that the ghastly images were seen by the great majority of the British population. They found their way to the rest of Europe too, and also crossed the Atlantic. The corpses and skeletal survivors of Belsen came to stand for all that the Allies had been fighting against for the last 6 years. That Nazi Germany had horribly mistreated the Jews living not only in their own country but also across the whole of Europe was an accepted fact during the war. Even before the war began in 1939, newspapers in other countries reported things such as the 1938 pogrom known as Kristallnacht. Word had leaked out from Poland before the camps were liberated that extermination was being carried out on an industrial scale in those places under German control was already known before the liberation of Belsen. Many of the world nations adopted what was seen as being up-to-date and modern views of race in the first half of the 20th century. We might recoil in horror from the idea of genocide now, or view with disgust the idea of sterilising people because they had a history of indolence and petty crime. But in both Europe and the United States, the ideology and practices so enthusiastically embraced by Hitler and his followers were seen by many in the decades before the Second World War as the salvation of mankind. By sterilising those unfit to have children and making sure that black people and white led separate lives, it was thought that society would be the beneficiary. It must not be forgotten that it wasn't only in the Deep South in the United States that racial segregation was practiced during the 1930s and 1940s. The American Army operated a strict policy of separate units for black and white troops. It was in Germany, though, from 1933 to 1945 that supposedly scientific racism reached the greatest extent and was taken to its logical conclusion. These theories led, of course, to the Holocaust, and as a consequence, scientific racism became, in the minds of many people, forever associated with the images of Auschwitz, Belsen, and Treblinka. Of course, any sound and reasonable idea may be corrupted by fools and rogues, or used for wicked and immoral purposes. One remembers, of course, Jesus' teaching, the love of our fellow beings and the forgiveness of enemies, which are indubitably lofty and praiseworthy ideals. That the Spanish Inquisition could take the teachings of this gentle prophet and use them as justification for the slaughter of Protestants and Jews seems almost beyond belief. In the same way, the egalitarian theories of Marx and Engels were the justification used for the concentration camps of the Soviet Union. So too with scientific racism. In itself, the idea was innocuous and unremarkable. That the percentages of those with above average intelligence might vary from one ethnic group to another is not of itself surprising or objectionable. One may certainly acknowledge such a state of affairs without feeling the urge to lynch anybody or arrange for the systematic segregation of one ethnicity from another. This, though, is where the idea of the slippery slope or thin end of the wedge comes into play. The revelation of the true extent of the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis in the cause of supposed racial differences had the most profound effect upon the world, especially in Europe and the United States. It is no exaggeration to say that the newsreel films of what was found in the concentration camps marked a turning point in Western views of scientific racism. This led ultimately to the United States having the decision of the Supreme Court in 1954 to rule against segregated schools, and in 1964 to the passing of the Civil Rights Act. In Britain, the year following the passing of America's Civil Rights Act, the first Race Relations Act was passed, which outlawed discrimination on the ground of ethnicity or race. In both Britain and America, progressive thought was firmly set in the years following the end of the Second World War against anti-Semitism and racial prejudice directed against visible minorities. There may have been resistance to such radical ideas from the mass of ordinary people, but the feeling was certainly gaining strength that scientific racism had been proved wanting and that its day was over. Events such as the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa in 1960 and the Civil Rights Movement in America cemented this belief in the minds of many politicians, intellectuals and academics. When in 1968 British politician Enoch Powell made his infamous Rivers of Blood speech, there was universal condemnation from all shades of political opinion. Scientific racism was no longer seen as a respectable doctrine in the modern post-war world. Even before the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s, there were influential thinkers and academics who were determined to show that race was a cultural rather than a biological phenomenon. A few years later, the results of unfettered scientific racism were there for all to see in the photographs and moving pictures produced in the Nazi concentration camps after Germany's defeat in 1945. In Hitler's Germany, scientific racism had been taken to its logical conclusion, and this, thought much of the world, was what happened. At this point, we pause and consider what might have happened next, as opposed to what actually did happen. The Holocaust revealed what happens if conscienceless psychopaths gain unlimited power and are thus enabled to follow any kind of crackpot idea which comes into their heads. Of course, Nazi Germany also rejected conventional physics because of its association with Jewish scientists. They embraced instead the mad idea of an eternal struggle between ice and fire as a basis for cosmology and indeed even meteorology. There were any number of peculiar ideas floating about in Hitler's Germany, and some related to strange ideas about race. It might have been possible to stand back a little after the end of the war and ask searching questions about the extent to which the Nazi actions in setting up the machinery of extermination was based upon what was reasonable to believe about the difference between various ethnicities, and to what extent it was just the Germans adopting a crazy course of action based upon a misunderstanding of science. Of course, in the late 1940s, following the execution at Nuremberg of the criminals responsible for the atrocities of Auschwitz, Belsen and so on, there was little appetite for taking a balanced view of anything in which the Nazis had been deeply involved. Their actions had served to contaminate all with which they had been associated, not least their idiosyncratic interpretation of scientific racism. Auschwitz was taken as confirmation of all that had been preached for years by some left-wing anthropologists in the United States. Racism led to mass murder, lynching, segregation, and apartheid. The pendulum had begun to swing from uncritical acceptance of the superiority of European civilization and all its works towards the largely uncharted waters of regarding other societies in different parts of the world as being equal or even superior to Western civilization. After all, the Germans had been pioneers of European civilization, and just look what that had led to. This was, although it's only possible to see so in retrospect, a revolution in the making. The assumption of European superiority had been unchallenged by most people for a very long time, and this belief had been founded in large part on the knowledge that ethnic groups other than white Western European Gentiles were somehow deficient. As is also so often the case, this led to the baby being thrown out with the bathwater, as the old saying has it. Instead of carefully considering every aspect of scientific racism and sifting through the different strands to see which might be sound and which wrong-headed and dangerous, there was now a subconscious tendency for many of those leading the intellectual life of Europe and America to reject wholesale everything to do with racism. This didn't take place overnight, it took several decades, but within 30 or 40 years of the first images of the Holocaust being widely circulated, scientific racism was regarded by anybody with pretensions to being modern and progressive as outmoded and liable to lead to the most wicked consequences. Of course, the current of thought could have moved in another direction entirely. A clear distinction could have been drawn between the exercise of racial prejudice and discrimination, which had indeed led to terrible suffering not only in Nazi Germany but across the world, and the simple concept of scientific racism. It might have been agreed that racial prejudice was a bad thing, while at the same time asking if it was now quite certain that there were no inherent differences between ethnic groups in cognition, physical development, and so on. This is not, though, how such processes generally work in history. The new ideology is typically in definite opposition to the old, and from that contradiction or conflict, a new and improved ideal will in time emerge. So it was that from believing that all the characteristics of different races were entirely determined by biology, enlightened thinkers now asserted that none of them were. Everything relating to race was now solely the proper business of sociologists, and every ethnicity was of precisely equal intellectual ability to every other one, whether Asian or American, Jew or Gentile, black or white. This being so, the natural corollary was that if Chinese people did better at mathematics than those from Africa, then it was because of cultural factors at home or the schools which they attended. If white countries were more prosperous and law-abiding than those in the Caribbean, then this too was no more than a cultural affect. Obviously, colonialism had held back the development of Africa, which accounted for the typically low IQs which were recorded there. In the United States, segregated schools had similarly held back the potential of black pupils. Every perceived difference between the performance of black people and white could be explained away by inequalities, either between nations or within the societies of individual countries. The new world was at hand. All that was necessary now was to make sure that everybody had the same access to housing and employment, education and opportunities for social advancement, and we would soon watch Africans, Caribbeans and African Americans surge forward and take their rightful place at the top table with everybody else. It was this unbridled and naive post-war enthusiasm which gave rise to what is sometimes known as the egalitarian dogma, and has now become the prevailing, although generally unspoken and subconscious view today on anything relating to ethnicity and race. Anthropologists in the United States, people like Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict, were convinced, as early as the 1920s, that the idea of essential and inherent differences between ethnic groups was mistaken, and that everything which appeared to distinguish the behaviour of one human population from another could be explained by culture alone. Whether IQs or incomes, criminal records or academic achievement, according to the new view which was being championed in some quarters of the United States before the Second World War began, literally any observed differences were the product of imperfect societies. The egalitarian doctrine was thus waiting, ready-made as one might say, when the post-war disgust at the Holocaust was causing many people to think seriously about where racial prejudice and scientific racism might lead. The reaction against scientific racism was powerful and still dominates almost all discourse on the topic of race today in the Western world. In addition to the effect which knowledge of the Holocaust had when the subject of scientific racism was broached, there were a few scandals in the post-war years which encouraged people to place more faith in the doctrine of egalitarianism than was perhaps justified. This, then, is the state of affairs in which we currently find ourselves. The idea of scientific racism has been completely rejected and is now regarded as disreputable, frankly. The egalitarian doctrine is triumphant, and although people seldom articulate even to themselves what they think when it comes to race, the egalitarian doctrine is what they subscribe to. Anybody not subscribing to it is regarded as a heretic, a madman, or being particularly wicked or stupid. A view which I need hardly say some people hold of me. I will explore this topic further in videos in the coming days, but I thought that it might be useful just to clear the ground a little and explain how it has come about that scientific racism has been so thoroughly rejected in the modern world.